I'd also like to welcome the people sitting on my right and my left. Sue Elliott is a well-known figure in the actuarial profession, leading the healthcare PEC for a number of years. And when I led the life PEC for a number of years, it was good to work with Sue. And we've got before us the paper from this working party. Sue and Hamish on her left are going to speak to us in a second or two, and we've got Sophie and Ian here who will help bat the cheeky questions back, I'm sure, as well, in due course. And so the plan for the evening is we're going to get a presentation from Sue and Hamish. And I think, are you happy to take some questions as you go through the presentation, or would you rather wait to the end? I think the plan was if people want to ask questions as you're talking, that's all right, or would you rather they waited? Right, okay, good. I just wanted to check. My briefing said that we were going to take them as we go through. So with no further ado, Sue's going to take the floor.
Okay, this paper that we're presenting to you tonight is a work in progress. So as the heading says, it's not finished. And the purpose of tonight was to get your feedback and builds to feed into producing the final paper. We have noticed a few typos along the way, but they'll be corrected for the final version. And we get into the discussion, we may find things like maybe additional countries to be covered. But in the paper, you'll see that we've covered 6 countries. And the reasons we picked those 6 was either because they were relatively successful in private long-term care insurance. I use the term relatively. And the examples are France, I think they've got 15% penetration, and the US is about 10%. And also for their extremes in public versus private partnership and funding. And those examples include Germany, Japan, and the Netherlands. And obviously the UK is in there because we're comparing to the UK. In the paper, there were 6 measures illustrating the demand for long-term care. But for these introductory slides, just going to look at 4 of them. In the paper, there was the population projections, life expectancy trends, the pyramids, dependency ratios, social changes, and expenditure on healthcare and long-term care. So, first thing we're going to look at is the population projections. The age 65 plus, which is on the left-hand side, Japan has had the greatest proportion of age 65 plus in 2010, and it also has the greatest growth, where the proportion is projected to almost double by 2050. As a scale on it, it's 2010s on the left and 2050s on the right for each of the graphs. In contrast, the US has the lowest current population over 65, and it also has the lowest projected growth. The range in 2010 was the lowest in one country was 13% to a high of 23%. And in 2050, the range is increased from 21% to 40%. So quite significant change. Age 85 plus, the comparison between countries is similar, with Japan having the highest proportion and the US the lowest. And the range increases from 2010 from 2% to 8%, more than doubling. In 2050, going from 5% to 12%. Now we're going to look at the population pyramids. I'm not going to go through every pyramid. Basically, for each of the countries, we looked at 2010 and 2050, the projected pattern. And you'll see that the ages 45 to 60 represent the baby boomers, and which will be moving to the top of the pyramids as the projection goes on, and that's when they'll appear to be top-heavy. The pyramids will. You'll see that Japan is the most pronounced for this, and it's not surprising given the previous slides that we've seen where there's low birth rates and high life expectancy. On this slide, we've got France and Germany. It is showing an increase in the older population, but not as pronounced as you're going to see in the next slide. The top one is Japan. You can really see the increase in 2050 in the top right there. Again, for the Netherlands is increasing, all significant. But on the next slide, it's the one that's kind of strange. I don't know what's going on in the US there. It's got a funny pattern. We're trying to figure out reasons why for that. Maybe we can talk about that in the discussion. But they've got quite a different pattern than the other countries. And the United Kingdom, again, is showing the same thing with the baby boomers moving up in 2050. Next, we'll move on to the dependency ratios. The dependency ratio is the ratio of age 65 plus divided by the population age 15 to 64. So it shows the number of people who are supported by the working age population. For all 6 countries, it's increased over time from 1960 to 2008. I stop at 2008 because some countries didn't have data that went to 2011. But it's just showing that the working population is having to support an increasing share of the elderly. And again, Japan shows the most significant increase from 9% in 1960 to 37% in 2008. They're the blue line that starts down there at the bottom, and then up to 38 there, I say, at the top right. So almost 4 times what they started out in 1960. And again, the U.S. has showed the slowest growth. So there's a pattern emerging here. Next, we're going to look at the summary of the current public and private systems for each of the 6 countries studied. This is a slide summarizing which is in the paper, which I believe was chapter 3. This indicates for each of the 6 countries the source of funding, the eligibility criteria, whether it's universal or not, or there's means testing, and the benefit types, whether it be home care or just institutional care. Starting with France, there's a combination of funding, local at 70%, and central tax and social insurance at 30%. And that's funded through employers' social security contributions and general tax. There's a national scale for assessing, but it only covers dependency, and it doesn't cover hotel costs. It's the individual responsibility. So for those of you who have been following DILNOT here in the UK, it sounds familiar to that cap that we're hearing about that doesn't cover the hotel costs. Germany, it's a social insurance system with a compulsory private insurance opt-out. Those people can opt out are the high earners, civil servants, and self-employed. The Netherlands, social insurance scheme, which is universal, covering both home and institutional care. Japan, they've got 5 social insurance schemes, with long-term care being just one. And they cover both home and institutional care. The US, their main program is Medicaid. It's their safety net. It's 39% of their funding is coming from Medicaid. It's jointly funded through the federal government and the states. It has a bias towards institutional care, and it's means tested, and it's focused on people with limited income. It'd be similar to, say, what we have here in the UK for our means tested, our current social care benefits. And the UK, as I say, it looks similar to the US with the current system. Next, looking at the public versus private expenditure on long-term care. This is from 2009 data from the OECD stats. The data indicated that France and Netherlands are all publicly funded. We have to dig into that further because we know France is not all publicly funded. They do have a private insurance market. It could be because of the date that the data was collected. In 2007, I think there's about 1% private. Now it's about 15% in 2010. But we're going to dig into that deeper for the final paper. But the big reason for the increase has been the wide media discussions, which has increased the public awareness about the risks and the funding gaps. So a potential lesson for the UK. Also, group insurance is quite large in France. I think it's about 45% in 2009. The other ones, Japan is 86% publicly funded, Germany 71%, US 59%, and the UK is around 60%, although that's come from a different data source. I think we got that from the DILNOT paper. Don't know why the OECD did not cover the UK. The next thing we're going to look at, of the total expenditure, the split between healthcare and long-term care. The lowest expenditure on long-term care was the US, and the highest was the Netherlands. Again, looking to the countries, particularly there, say the Netherlands, what lessons can we learn from them? And then finally, looking at the countries that do have universal schemes. We're going to look at Germany, Netherlands, and Japan. No, I dropped France off because we know that it is not universal. Germany, the purchasers are social insurance funds and private insurance schemes. As you can opt out if you have high earners, civil servants, or self-employed. And it counts the social insurance as payroll deduction of just under 2% of payroll, and private insurance is income-related contributions. Netherlands is done through regional care offices, and it's payroll and income-related, and also means-tested co-payments. Percentage of payroll, again, with a maximum of about 330 euros per month. Japan is a pay-as-you-go, municipality-run. General tax is 45%. Income-related contributions, which are mandatory, of 45%, and then a co-payment of 10%. For the mandatory 45% in the middle there, it's about 1% of payroll for your working years and about $30 US per month for 65 plus. In Japan, I think what's making them different is that providing care and public assistance to the elderly, it's seen as a national responsibility. So I think there's a real ethos there about that. Say the benefits are set by national government, but it's all run locally, which I guess is similar to the UK assessments. Well, maybe not set nationally, but I think that's what we're trying to get, is to have a common national assessment. So I think that's all I'm going to cover for now. The idea was for me to set the scene of the research we did, and then the next part of the paper was on the lessons learned, and Hamish is going to take us through that. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Sue. Just before I go on to lessons learned, being a good Scotsman, I'll just add a wee bit about Scotland. What we showed for the UK was predominantly England and the devolved nations Wales and Northern Ireland. In Scotland, there is free personal care for everybody over age 65 and free nursing care for every citizen, depending on eligibility for the need for care. No financial test. However, in Scotland, under that, you don't get entitled to attendance allowance if you get the free personal care, and also you don't get entitled to the NHS separate nursing care that you would in England. So effectively, it almost works out quite similar, and it's not quite as different to England as it's maybe made out. Okay, given that, I will move on to the next slide, please. Okie dokie. So some lessons learned. So we started with France, and as Sue mentioned, insurance or private sales have increased substantially over the last 4 or 5 years. And we believe that's really to do with the public awareness that was made in France. In France, everybody works a National Solidarity Day. So the fact that they do that really makes it, awareness of the long-term care need. And also, because of that awareness, we think people are more and more going out and buying the insurance. One other lesson from France was that the cash payment seems to give a lot more empowerment to the individuals. In Germany, a good one that we learned there was the opt-out was taken by quite a lot of the higher earners in the population and has grown an insurance market. So instead of paying the mandatory percentage of payroll, you can opt out and use that to fund insurance yourself and maybe take out a better level of coverage. And if you go back to what Sue showed on the slides, it's created maybe quite a substantial insurance market and substantial public spending. Netherlands was the universal coverage and very little private financing. I think the lesson learned from there that it's maybe getting out of control because it is universal. It was supposed to be to cover the sort of last resort needs for long-term care, but it more and more seems to have slipped into the coverage, and the it's getting more and more expensive to fund and perhaps isn't sustainable for the Netherlands. Also, offering the cash payments has led to greater inefficiencies in the market, and the nursing homes, etc., aren't run in the most efficient manner. Japan, we believe that it's becoming unsustainable as well, the level of under the level of payments, so we believe they might be cutting back on benefits. In the US, there was a big announcement by President Obama on bringing in this Class Act scheme. It was part of the Medicare reforms over the last few years. But actually, when the actuaries started having a look at it, it was found to be unworkable because of the anti-selection risks. Too few healthy people were signing up, and it seemed to be more and more people with the need that were signing, and therefore the contributions were going to get mushroom out of control. So it was stopped about a year ago. No further development. A good one maybe for us to think about in the US is that they introduced an asset protection insurance. This could maybe, if this was brought in combination with DILNOT, it might reduce the costs a bit. So people actually take out insurance against the level of assets that's used for their means testing. I think there's maybe an opportunity to us to sort of try and work that a bit more and see if we could get it for this country. But a lesson I think we learned from just about every country is that costs are spiraling out of control. We've seen the demographic time bomb. And to make them long-term sustainable, they're either having to reduce the levels of benefits or they're having to increase the funding. For our country, we're now in a position where we may be introducing DILNOT. There's been a wee bit of noise about that it's looking more likely. But we believe a real lesson learned from every other country that it has to be sustainable. And especially if we want to grow an insurance market, for as insurers to get involved, we have to be seeing something that's sustainable and won't change 2 or 3 years down the line as a new government comes in and decides it's too expensive. Next slide, please. So before we start the discussion, as authors, we wanted to maybe take a wee step back of where the paper's been heading. Through the research, we found there's a lot of papers out there looking at global funding methods. But we as an actuarial profession, maybe we should be looking at something a wee bit different rather than just repeating the message from other papers. And so we'd like to kind of engage everybody in a bit of discussion on this, but ideas might be maybe doing some model validation of the DILNOT costings, adding some sort of stress test scenarios to it to see how sustainable it might be. Another route we maybe could head down is looking what is the most likely to try and grow a private insurance market. But we're looking for you to be involved in this discussion, which is why we've kind of presented the paper now rather than waiting for us to finish just going down the same track of just commenting on what other funding models are. So next slide, please. But saying all that, we've just put up a few prompts that might help the discussion. How some of these models, if we were to take them in, might integrate. I suppose that the bottom one is an important question. Is DILNOT a done deal? So is there any point in us learning anything about these other countries because we're going full steam ahead with DILNOT? And next slide, please. So some of the prompts for the discussion, should there be compulsion or optionality? What works best between a social insurance fund or pay-as-you-go? Should there be an element of shared cost or the universal free coverage? Again, looking back at the lessons learned, should it be cash payments or benefits in kind? And really, what will grow an insurance market? And perhaps how could we perhaps integrate this with the pension system? These are all just prompts maybe to help the discussion. So I'll maybe pass back to David to chair it.
Thanks very much, Hamish. So this is now your turn. And often at this stage there's a deathly hush from the floor and the chairman thinks it goes down his list of questions. To save me doing that, it would be good to get some views from the floor. I hope we have a microphone. I'm trying to catch, we do. The microphone's just arrived. So when the microphone comes, if you could just give your name before your comment or question, that would be helpful. So the floor is open. There's a gentleman down here in the front row. And here comes the microphone.
The most significant part of the paper is section 5.1.6. Graph 9 indicates that financial sustainability is the most important policy priority for long-term care systems in the OECD. However, no mention is made of exactly what level of care is to be provided by the financially sustainable long-term care system. Funding methods are dictated by general financial conditions. At present, interest rates are being kept low, and large amounts of extra money are being printed. This indicates pay-as-you-go rather than long-term funding methods. Coming now to the health deficit, a limit of life of 100 corresponds to a net continuous deterioration in health of about 5% per annum, combined with one small drop just before death at age 100. And if you have a limit of life of 125, as I believe exists in small communities in China, that corresponds to a net continuous deterioration in health of about 4% per annum, combined with one equivalent small drop just before death at age 125. In the United Kingdom, for the past 60 years, the limit of life, measured by the age of the oldest inhabitant, has never gone above 115 years. I think it's more profitable, incidentally, to look at the age of the oldest inhabitant as the limit of life for the rest of us, rather than to go round and buttonhole the oldest inhabitant and ask them what they owe their oldest inhabitancy to, you know, saying a cheerful disposition and all that sort of thing. Well, obviously they should have a cheerful disposition, having lived a bit longer than everybody else, but that's a very narrow way of looking at it. We look at it as the limit of life. It's far more significant. Right. At the same time, people have generally been living longer than they used to, thanks to advances in care and medical science. These advances keep people alive, but do not significantly extend their capability for work. The longer they live, the more they consume. The gross health deficit has gone up over the years. The obesity ratio is always on the increase. Care and medical science have had to be improved continuously in order to keep the net deterioration in health down. The gross health deficit is occasioned by a number of factors: poor diet, lack of exercise, pollution. Diet in the United Kingdom is rich in cooked fat and oil and other harmful substances. Bacon remains the UK's most popular foodstuff. As regards exercise, less manual work is being done. People used to walk or cycle or walk to the bus stop or to the railway station. The advent of the private cars reduced these forms of exercise. Pollution is everywhere. Fine particle air pollution is more penetrative to the lungs than coal-fired air pollution. You can blow your nose and blow the coal-fired air pollution out of your nose and that sort of thing, but the oil-driven fine particle pollution goes straight down to the lungs. I quote the Chinese experience for that, and they should know because they've got fine particle air pollution all over Beijing at the present moment. Long-term care costs can be brought down, as seems to be the desirable thing from Section 5.16, provided something concrete is said and done about poor diet, lack of exercise, and pollution. This will increase the limit of life. The limit of working life will also increase. Consumers will become producers. And just an item of interest, the UK's oldest inhabitant, Grace Jones, was 112 years and 302 days old on October the 4th, 2012. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I must admit that I don't, apart from looking after my 89-year-old father, I don't know very much about this subject. But I did wonder, as a question to the authors, gender-neutral pricing in Europe, is private long-term care insurance a class of business that will be particularly affected by this? And will it affect either the value for money that can be offered by private insurers, or alternatively the soundness of the insurance company offering any long-term care products?
That's an interesting question. Do you want to just take that now then, Sue, and also pick up the other gentleman's points too, if you wish. Sue.
On the gender neutral, yes, it will be picked up by that. But the only products available right now in the UK insurance market is immediate needs annuities, and they're all subject to individual case-by-case underwriting. So it's a question legally, can you get around it that way? I know that's something that we're looking at right now. But obviously we can't use a male table and a female table, but due to the very nature of the immediate needs annuities, it's rated on the individual case. And you look at the life expectancy for that case, it's not drawn from a table. But there are some things that have been into the gender directive, is being able to use some of the underwriting factors. So sort of a long answer to say yes, it is impacted there. Gentleman here, not sure there's a question there. You talked about the importance of the level of care. I think that's very important. But I think the key thing in 5.1.6 was the fiscal and financial sustainability. But the top four things there, financial sustainability, home care, quality of services, which is, I think you're talking about the level of care, and integration of health and long-term care. I think those are key things for the UK market. I do take your points, though, about diet, exercise, and pollution. That would impact on any healthcare product, not just for long-term care. But if the people we're seeing are living in beyond 100, which some cases we may see that, because some products we don't have a maximum age, then you could have people there who are in a very disabled state, or if they've got to 99 and they're very healthy, well, they could live on for 10 years. And we just have to figure out how we price that. Does anybody else from the panel want to add anything?
Yeah, just for the gentleman here, I agree with you that there's been no evidence of the extension of mortality in the UK, and it's very much on the compression of mortality. And we're seeing quite a lot of the gains in longevity being socioeconomically related. So there is a big gain still out there to be had if people on lower socioeconomic classes or those in worse diets followed the lead of who's moved earlier to get these longevity gains. So it's out there to be had.
The question of the level of care that was raised in that first session is an interesting one. I mean, clearly you could deliver a very poor level of care, and the financial implications would obviously result in a lower cost. Those sort of considerations are more political considerations and not perhaps one that the actuarial profession have a deep say. But the role of the actuarial profession, I think, is very much around the financial implications. and the sort of modelling that we can bring to bear, which is the nature of our profession. So long-term care is a complex subject. It covers a wide range of different aspects, and including things like prevention, which is mentioned so many times, but it's something that is never really grappled with. But I think we need to really concentrate on where we can really make an impression.
Colin Redman. It's interesting about looking at the very, very good paper that's been produced for tonight. One of the things you come across actually is the similarities between Japan and Scotland. I know this might seem a strange thing to say, but both have a system that's been going for a number of years and they've built up a lot of experience. Japan's been going 12 years, essentially unaltered during that time, and Scotland similarly. And yet both of these systems were pretty ridiculed when they were started, that they wouldn't work and that they were misconceived and so on. And yet both have shown good experience and have gone along relatively unamended. Now you can look at both of these systems now and say, are they sustainable? And the answer is probably not, without some adjustment over the longer term. And I think what we have to consider is what we mean by sustainability. How long is sustainability and how do we achieve sustainability? I think it would be helpful to look at these things. It seems to me if it was sustainable for 20 years, given what we know about the future, that would be a very, very long time. We can't assume that it will be sustainable for 50 years or 100 years. And the question is, how do we make it sustainable? The thing is, if we looked at pensions, if we have pension schemes with adjustable pension ages, those are much more sustainable than those without. And I think it would be helpful to look at DILNOT and consider what could happen in the future to maybe adjust caps or whatever, which would make them more sustainable. A lot of these things, I think about implementation, are as much as will to do something as anything else. I was amazed looking back to the 1940s. We had the Beveridge Report in 42, the Education Act 44, start of the welfare state and the start of the National Health Service. All of these things happened at a time when we had severe economic problems. We had fighting a war in the early 40s, and we were relying on Marshall aid, Marshall Plan for the balance of the 40s, when we were essentially bankrupt. And you can do something even if you don't have a lot of money. A lot of it is how high it is up your list of priorities. And I think this is the thing with DILNOT. It's a report that has very, very wide support from virtually all of the voluntary organisations and those involved with the ages, with the elderly. And perhaps it should be seen as a done deal, but we need to make it happen rather than we need to look at alternatives. So how could we produce further information that would help the implementation of something in the UK which would solve a lot of the problems that we have now?
Quite a few different points in that. I think, I'm not quite sure who's reaching for the microphone here to start with. It looks like Sue was keen, but Sophie, are you wanting to say a few words? Go for it.
So I was looking at the Netherlands, and their system started in 1968. And at that point, it was decided that the responsibility for care of the elderly would be the responsibility of the state, whereas childcare is very much the responsibility of the family. And it did start as just covering catastrophic costs. But it was a very idealistic system, and it would cover such things as making sure that the elderly were integrated socially, that they weren't isolated, and things that have been added along the years and changed. So I guess I would just say that it has been as just a system that in constant state of flux and re-examination. And for them, the budget is set every few years, and if the economic situation they can't cover what they were providing, they adjust that. So maybe the lesson learned from that is that you, as Colin was saying, you can't plan for 50 years ahead. You have to accept there will be changes. And I don't know how that can be allowed for.
Just from the actuarial profession perspective on how we can help with DILNOT and the implementation thereof, We have written to Jeremy Hunt, the new Health Secretary, and Norman Lamb, the new Social Care Minister, putting forward what our skill sets are, as Ian mentioned, about modelling, funding, etc. We're just waiting to hear back as to, we don't want to miss the boat on this, to sort of add to the debate where we can. They are setting up groups with key stakeholders, and we want to make sure that we're one of those key stakeholders. We've had discussions before the DILNOT recommendations. I know Ian and I went to the Department of Health to discuss things there prior to the publication of the recommendations in July of last year. But I think the concept of a partnership concept, that the sustainability of that, whatever goes into the partnership, the details may change over time, but the sort of the ethos around a partnership, realizing that not one can fund it, it has to be between the two. And going all or nothing, you can see how things have, say, if you've mentioned for Japan and Scotland, that where things haven't been sustainable, that to have some type of buy-in from both sides. But how you get that, because I know the US has tried on partnerships, limited success in 4 states. Any other comments?
Yeah, just very quickly, I think Colin hit the nail on the head there, that the DILNOT recommendations had central estimates of the cost, and the modelling around those central estimates, I'm not sure I've actually seen in any detail, and I think it's something that, as a profession, it really fits in with our core competencies. You also mentioned the question of sustainability with reference to Japan having been stable for about 20 years. But some of the countries that we looked at had, in their mind, sustainable models that would last for several decades, yet had to be adjusted very shortly afterwards. So I think we really need to understand the lessons of why they made what appeared sensible decisions at the time, but in practice they didn't turn out that way.
Thank you. Perhaps I shouldn't speak again. I've already had my chance, but I wanted to talk about this very interesting topic, very interesting paper, and just bring something up about the modelling aspect. Living in Canada, as Sue will attest, gives you a perspective on, because our neighbour, Canada, and its nearest neighbour have very different ideas on social cohesion and the cost and value of providing safety nets. The figures in the paper, and I suspect that deterministic funding, that we don't really know where it's all come from, the models, probably the figures are all aggregated, but what we know from studying longevity is that the social class aspect or the income aspect of how long you'll live, how well you'll live, what your needs will be, is a major aspect of the cost. So it's very different models for people from lower income groups than for people from higher income groups. And particularly when you're thinking about working in this integration, of private benefits and state benefits, I think we want to be very aware and try to avoid the situation where the state benefits are being overly paid for by an income class that maybe won't benefit so much. And this is also a problem with the proposals to increase state retirement ages, for example. And releasing funds through reverse equity mortgages, I think that was somewhere in here. That's not very useful if you've never owned a home, for example. But I do think that wherever this ends up, I mean, this is such a rich area for the insurance market, the private side, and I know you've been focusing more on the public side. But the insurance design is at its best when we create transparent products that meet a real need in society. This is clearly an area where we have a lot of opportunity, and particularly it's a risk pooling area rather than a excess investment yield area, and that has particular attractions in the current market. So I think that from all sides, funding and then designing solid, supportive private products, we have a lot to offer here.
Thanks. Before I ask the panel to comment on that, I'll go back to the gentleman here, 4th row, 2 in. Thanks.
Roy Colburn. Chairman, I was disappointed in Ian's earlier response about level of care It seems to me that you can't separate the costing from what you're achieving. And unless you look at this holistically and say, well, are we providing a satisfactory level of care, and what does it cost to provide one, provide a level that we would accept for our own parents or even ourselves, it seems to me vital. And if we haven't got the resources, then maybe we have to team up with somebody who has. But I've noticed particularly what a high proportion of GDP the Dutch are prepared to spend on long-term care. I've only been into one care home in Holland, but the level of provision was absolutely amazing, and you can see what they're achieving. And of course, the Dutch, as I'm sure the authors well know, have now got this village for dementia sufferers. I know it's only a one-off, but the level that they're aiming at in terms of life care, whereas, one goes into a care home in this country, and I still feel the pattern is a lounge full of old ladies sitting around, nodding, and we're just not achieving something that we would regard as acceptable if it was for us.
Thank you. I just wonder whether it'd be helpful at this point, Sue, if you were to clarify what questions you're trying to answer, because there are very helpful questions here about, the quality of care, how much should a system attempt to fund. Then we've got other questions about how would you go about modelling, the different parameters are going to influence that. In particular, are you trying? What's the question you're trying to answer? Have you got one particular question you're trying to answer, or are you just trying to cover actually quite a broad range of actuarial help for the Dilnot Commission?
I think we started off trying to cover a broad range, but as I said, we're taking a wee bit of a step back and think, as a profession, what can we give that's most value from our profession, and not just a repeat of inputs that other areas can give. So I'm kind of with what Ian mentioned as well. We can challenge the model. We can put some actuarial rigor on the model validation, stress test it, change the benefit design to kind of negate areas where it becomes unsustainable. We do it all the time when we're designing products for long-term products. So can we apply that sort of rigor to the public financing element? That to me is the key. But secondary to that as well is we are a lot of us work in the insurance industry, and what actual insurance products can we help design alongside this that try and meet the gap in the need between that's left after, because it's clear that that there's not a groundswell of opinion in England in particular to completely publicly finance long-term care. So there is a gap. So our secondary thing is, how can we help fill that gap?
I'm just going to add to that, not as an author, but as chair of the Health and Care PEC, that we're always, given in health and care that there's such a social aspect to it as well, we do incorporate that into our thinking, but we have to be very careful not to comment on it, because it will go outside our code of conduct. We get reminded of that from the public affairs, that if we start straying into that, but we don't not incorporate it into our thinking. We realize it has to be there, but like talking about the level of care and that, we realize that depending on the level of care, the quality of care, it's going to impact on the modeling, it'll impact on the costs, etc. But yeah, it'd be interesting. Like we've got the chief exec there, president and president-elect, and all that. That are we constraining ourselves too much? I know I keep referring to the code, but I'm putting you on the spot. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I think that's very helpful. So, folks, I don't know whether we ask for a vote or whether we just ask for comments, but I think one of the questions that I'm hearing here is, if the actual profession is going to prepare some actuarial material that would help the country consider these issues, should we just restrict ourselves to, if you like, actuarial modelling, or should we be going further and perhaps working with other organisations in helping to, if you like, clarify the choices of levels of care and methods of meeting need, that exist in other parts of the world or exist in people's imagination. So there's a question. Do we limit ourselves to just modeling, or do we go much wider and try and foster debate using our analytical skills, but in consultation with other organizations?
Just a couple of points. Firstly, this question, how far should the health PEC push the boundaries out in research in this area? Well, I would actually just encourage you to keep pushing, to keep trying to stretch out, because I do think this is an area where we really can add value to the debate. And if you get to the point and someone really screams you've gone too far, then you've probably gone just about far enough, would be my sort of push there. I've been focusing my mind on this question of how we grow the insurance market in this country, which I think really is how we grow the private insurance market. We have a degree of public insurance there today. We perhaps don't like it because it includes people having to sort of sell their houses to pay for their part of the public system, but we have a partial public system. As far as private insurance is concerned, I start by actually sort of looking at the history. And as the authors said, that actually when you look today, that actually there's not much more than immediate care annuities available in the market. If, however, you look back sort of 15 years ago, there were actually some quite innovative products developed in this marketplace. I know my old shop had some of them, whereby not only they could pre-fund care, there was actually levels of care. There was a gold, a silver, and a blue product, which actually provided different level of benefits that were going to be there. But it wasn't a lack of actuarial design or even actuarial pricing for the products. Actually, the demand has never been there. And so when I think we debate this question of what would make a successful private insurance market, we've got to look at this question of demand. And in one sense, I think it is extremely challenging because in our society, we're not really saving enough for the living years. So trying to persuade people to save for the dying years is extremely difficult. And I do wonder whether in this country we're going to have to open up the debate again about the fiscal approach to premiums for this insurance. We know from history that in the days when private medical insurance, the over 65 could get tax relief on their premiums, there was a much, much bigger market which actually collapsed almost when that tax relief was taken away. So I wonder whether in the sort of further work for the Working Party, looking perhaps whether it's international comparisons or history in this country. But for me, if we're going to want to stimulate this market, and the market is going to be people in their 60s, in their 70s, who are starting to worry about the costs that it's going to be for their care, how do we motivate them to actually invest in a quality insurance product?
Paul Seymour, as you've said. I started in this long-term care business, I think 20 years ago, and I remember standing up just to echo what we've just heard, saying, what chance have we in creating a long-term care market? That's when the reinsurers were all keen on it. Because we can't even get people to do enough about their pensions. And to put that in perspective, with the Roundtree inquiry, which we had, and to answer one of those points, pointed towards a social insurance fund, and to keep the sustainability, it pointed towards having a non-government body that sort of determined what contribution rates ought to be. We called it in-flight corrections as you were trying to keep the ship afloat. But anyway, the point really is that it's 2% we're talking about, or thereabouts, for long-term care cost, and it's 20% or thereabouts for pension costs. And look where we are now on the subject of pensions. So I really do think that, I'm just echoing what Philip said, that actually to make an insurance market in this country is going to be extremely hard. And by the way, we were talking about partnership deals back then as well. Whether deal not happens or not, I have no idea. Clearly the insurance companies would like it to happen. because there is an insurance market that would fit in quite well there. But I don't know, really. I think pensions is more important.
Okay, and the gentleman in the second back row, his hand up.
Phil Simpson. I was one of those reinsurers 15 or 20 years ago that was trying to help develop the market. I think if you're going to look at the private long-term care insurance market such as it is, you're probably going to split into three. The richest people will probably pay as you go for high standard. There's always going to be some form of safety nets, but it's really the middle, which is probably where the industry can address itself. Again, looking back about 15 years ago to some of these innovative product designs that were talked about, at that time, one of the more interesting ones looked at utilising a pension pot to buy an annuity, but an annuity which would increase its payout as people became ill and were unable to perform the tasks of daily living. But at least at that time, I believe one of the problems with that product design was under the tax laws that out of a pension pot, you could not buy an annuity whose payments out were contingent on such an event, which is a pity because obviously the two largest pools of resource people have tend to be their pension pot and their house. So again, as far as I'm aware, that hasn't changed. So we seem to be suffering from some tax and HMRC limitations on product design. I mean, I think we effectively do have a long-term care insurance industry at the moment. It's called equity release. Just by default, when people get to advanced age, they run the risk of outliving their assets. And I know there is historically issues and stigma related to equity release. I think some of the more modern products overcome that, but there still is a mindset, particularly amongst the elder generation. Some of the survey feedback suggests that the younger generation are more happy to spend the house rather than the inheritance. But I think a major issue has been also alluded to is the uncertainty around how the state and the insurance industry interact. 15 years ago, things very much got kicked into the long grass because we had the Royal Commission on Long-Term Care. Its findings really got sort of sidelined and never really developed. Now we have DILMOT. I think until we get some sort of certainty about how the private and state sectors are going to interact, it's going to be very difficult for the long-term care industry to grow in any form of state other than perhaps things like equity release, which is probably not the ideal way of addressing the specific problem.
There was a talk about private insurance, and my question, actually the question, is it a possibility to widen the research or the possibility for all people who migrate from different country to country? Because everybody have been talking about UK all the time, but I think there could be a wide demand, the fourth part of demand of the people who are migrating from France to Netherlands, from Netherlands to UK. And I didn't see any research or to cover for such people who could look for such a cover for older age, because they probably won't have a house for annuities for a future, and they probably won't be covered by any other country because actually they are not living in any of the states of the European Union, for example, or even in the different countries.
Right, okay. There's a good suggestion for research. Paul, you wanted to say something? And then it's this gentleman at the back.
I will go in front of Dave. I just forgot to say something about the modelling point. The very first paper that I think it was then the Institute introduced with Steve Nuttall and others, we were invited by the Select Committee, I think for Health, to actually talk about this, and we were projecting long-term care costs. And I said to the people there, we could have a relatively benign scenario where the cost goes up by, I think it was 2030 then, of let's say 2 times in real money, or we could have an equally possible scenario where it goes up by a factor of 8 in real money. And they turned to me and said, well, you're useless, which is a lesson in itself. But actually, I said, no, I'm sorry, the message that I'm trying to give you is this, that you need to use tonight's language, I think I said robust system that will cope with scenarios as variable potentially in the future as that. Tonight's word is sustainable. And I think to try and get across the idea of sustainability, and I spoke about it in terms of the Roundtree recommendation, which was a sort of offline quango to set rates of contribution, and it was obviously compulsory and all those things that probably don't play very well anymore. But I don't think people do understand quite how potentially variable these outcomes are over long, long periods of time, and I think maybe we could get that message across.
Sure. It's been a very interesting debate, and there's a lot of points that I could echo, but I won't. But one point that I haven't heard, which always concerned me when I was, like Bill Simpson earlier, peddling long-term care insurance as a reinsurer some years back, was the fact that the claim triggers under private insurance vehicles may not match up with the care needs. And it was always a concern in my mind, and it's one that remains, if you put forward private insurance as a solution, that I could have perfectly genuine care needs, but not quite fail 3 of the specified activities of daily living. And there is an important mismatch there, I think, that has the potential to undermine the private insurance vehicle.
Thank you. My name is David Simmons. Looking at the first bullet point on the slide in front of us now, compulsion versus optionality. And the thought I have is that there is compulsion for the state. The state cannot just abandon people who can't care for themselves. And therefore maybe some form of compulsion of funding, perhaps akin to the new pension arrangements that we are coming at the moment, might be an appropriate thing to think about.
Okay, thank you. Last call. Authors, it's your chance. You get the microphone back. We'll start with Sue, and is that okay? Yes. Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for all your questions. And jotting things down, I've just gone back and highlighted the ones in pink. The things were questions. The point about waiting to see what happens on DILNOT. Regardless of DILNOT, there's still a need. DILNOT is not covering the hotel costs, and for the sector we're looking at from an insurance perspective, a lot of that's going to be in the medium wealth earners. And they are potentially going to be looking for better quality homes than you would get from a local authority funded bed. So the hotel costs could be quite significant. And that's something as a profession and as an industry we've been trying to get the government to understand that. And that was the first point. The next one about products and that. The disability-linked annuity, there was some clarification on that in September, issued by the HMRC in discussions with the ABI, so they have provided some clarification on it. But there's still some things in it that it's not as clear as we'd like to be, but at least it's a step forwards, and it need to be tested. Equity release and care, yes, I agree with that. Potentially a good one for domiciliary care. So if you got care in your own home. But again, I know the industry or the profession has done work on equity release before, and if we could combine that with the care actuaries and that, we can work together on that and look at some of the risks associated with that. We didn't really focus on private insurance that much in the paper. It could be a whole separate working party looking at the potential things that the profession can add for private insurance. We're not here to design the products, but we can add the funding element and the risk assessment, the data collection, etc. Things about DILNOT, the central modeling only and need new scenarios around the different variability. I think that's something that we should really push for. I've made a note for myself to follow up and see if we've had any responses from, I was going to say Jeremy Hunt, combine the two, and Norman Lamb. And we'll take on board the country-to-country integration. Hadn't thought about that, so should I pass over to Hamish now?
Thanks, Sue. Your rapid fire there just about covered everything. There was a bit on awareness, a question on awareness. So it's part of DILNOT was large public awareness. We're all going to become aware of it over the next 10, 20 years because it's just going to be happening all around us as our parents and more people are in need of long-term care. But trying to bring that awareness forward so that the public know that they have to take action. France seems to have done something that's worked, so maybe we can learn from France. The National Solidarity Day. Over the last couple of years, we've all had an extra bank holiday each. You know, maybe next year we can give up a day's work, a day's pay. Who knows? On the fiscal regime, I totally believe that in countries where they've brought other types of insurance into getting tax relief, like Australia, it has worked, it has grown the market, and to bring long-term care in, I think would be a very good move. I think that's all for me tonight.
Okay. I'm just thinking whether it would feel more palatable to give 2 days of your working life to each year to fund NHS costs or have additional national insurance contributions. It's an interesting way of packaging it up there. So that was just me filling in to let Sophie get the microphone and think about what she was going to say.
I was just going to say that I thought it was a very interesting point mentioning the differences that wealth and income has on people's long-term care needs in the future, and just to point out that with a system like the Netherlands, although it's universal in theory, in practice the co-payments are so high for the higher earners that they self-fund, and obviously in Germany there's the opt-out, so in reality it's not so universal. And just sort of thinking, obviously France had a lot of success with educating the country and had a big pickup in the private coverage, and I think education of the public has to be very key here, that people just aren't aware of the issue until you have a family member and you see the costs and you see the effects, and that getting people's children engaged. And I think the idea of losing your parents having to use their house to pay for care, I think they'd much rather inherit it, and that's quite an incentive that I think the market could be built on.
Mm-hmm. And Ian.
Yeah, I was interested at the number of times the word modelling got mentioned. I found that very encouraging. But there were a couple of points that I just wanted to pick up on. The phrase living years and dying years crept in, which Philip mentioned. And I think anyone who has a physical disability regards themselves as still in the living years. Now, it may get a little difficult when you have mental incapacity, but in general, people who are still alive think of themselves in the living years. And that, I think, is where this differentiation between pensions, the normal income while you're living, and long-term care, the income that you need when you're in a state of needing care, that boundary actually is not a clear one. And I think we've tended, as society, to create boundaries that actually don't exist. The income needs in retirement are to see you through the rest of your living years. The question of incentives, Dermot commented that he found the paper a little bit confusing as to what we were actually trying to achieve. One of the things that we were looking at was the reason why systems had come up in different ways in different territories. And right enough, incentives is quite often one of the key things. Now, maybe we didn't draw that out sufficiently in the paper, but that was certainly one of the underlying intents. DILNOT just happens to be the proposition that's on the table at the moment in the UK, so the paper wasn't aimed very specifically at DILNOT, but we can't ignore it. It is the flavour of the month. I couldn't actually catch Dave Grimshaw's question, I think, clearly enough, but I think it was around about the differentiation between the assessment of care needs under an insurance policy and under the state. And under the new proposals for the single assessment, if the insurance industry is willing to use that as the basis for providing cover, then those sort of differentiations shouldn't be as strong as they were in the past. And I also thought the comment about immigration, emigration is a very valid one. It does go right through the heart of the subject, not just in terms of the intergenerational strains that it introduces, where you have people in different territories, but we rely very heavily on immigration to actually provide the staff for care homes in the UK. It is a multi-layered question, and certainly one that I think bears looking at in more detail.
Good. Well, thank you very much, authors, and thank you very much to you. About an hour ago, when we had that hush at the start, I was thinking this could have been a very long hour, but in fact, it's shot past very quickly. We've had a very wide range of discussion. I got asked to kind of make some summary comments, and so over the next 2 hours, I would just like to summarize. To me, actually, you see, because there's a slide that we could put up, actually, we could put up the next step slide. This is what the authors are planning to do. Next one, I think, good. Okay, they're going to collate the feedback from the discussion. As you know, it's been recorded, so it will be recorded, also reproduced for posterity in the journal. But the plan of our colleagues here is to finalize the paper. I suspect, I don't know what year that's going to be in, because I think there's so many different ideas that have come out from this evening that it could, there's quite a large piece of work you could do. So I suspect if anybody from the floor wants to volunteer, or have colleagues who would like to volunteer, they would be gratefully received. Is that fair? To me, I think just very quickly, there were 4 broad headings that struck me from our discussion. We've talked a lot about modelling the funding costs, and I think there's a lot of data from different countries that could be used to show the consequences of the pyramids for funding costs and things. But also not just for the mean, but the tails of the distribution. What is the variability in this? And, you know, so there's kind of the arithmetic consequences of assumptions, but then there's also the sensitivity around those assumptions and what do the assumptions represent in terms of changes in the population or changes in lifestyle or whatever. And then we talked quite a bit about funding options and the consequences, so not, you know, how you're actually going to cover all of this cost. We've talked about the incentives from fiscal treatment, also how people will react to different, you know, cost structures that are put in place. Plenty of sort of volatility there and options to model. We've talked quite a bit about history, and some folk have given us the benefit of previous working parties and previous experiences. That probably is worth capturing. What man learns from history is that man doesn't learn from history, said Napoleon. But of course, actuaries, our motto is reason from experience. That's the motto of the Institute and faculty. So what we can learn from the past may well be very helpful in the future. And then, of course, we've got the point about what can we learn from other countries, both in terms of the movement of population, but also their experiences and what drives behaviour and what drives different designs. And I think the last thing that's my 4, but just ringing in my ears from all of them is Philip's comment that if anybody feels you've gone too far, you've probably gone to the right place. So talking about the right place is soon going to be out there where we have a glass of wine to celebrate getting through the evening and to celebrate our friendship and collaboration as actuaries. But just to say, if anybody had written comments that they would like to submit afterwards, please do. Those of you who have submitted comments, you'll get a chance to review them before they get reproduced in the British Actuarial Journal. And the next session of research meeting to look forward to is in just over a month's time, Monday the 26th of November, when Stephen Richards, Ian Curry and Gavin Ritchie will present their paper on a value at risk framework for longevity risk trend. And maybe next time we'll have a value at risk framework for long-term healthcare trends and variability. Who knows? Certainly not next month. But as you can tell, many of us have enjoyed reading the paper, are grateful to you for what you've done, and are looking forward to the next installment. So please join with me in thanking our speakers as I declare the meeting closed.